A while back, I did a video on ground schemes, and part 1 was on Marshall amps, and part 2 is going to be coming up after that. Well, that was 4 years ago, so I guess it's a little bit overdue, but here it is. Part 2, ground schemes and fenders. Now, in the first video, I had a whole bunch of information about what filter cap nodes are and how they work, and eddy currents and ground loops and all these kinds of things. And I'm not going to repeat that. So if you haven't seen part 1, it's in the description below, and there's a little black box up top right now. I strongly suggest you watch that. If it's been a while, because it could be up to 3.5 years since part 1, I do suggest that you refamiliarize yourself so everything I talk about here makes more sense. Back to the matter at hand, this is a 1965 Super Reverb. Someone had changed out the power transformer for Mercury, and some tech in the past replaced a whole bunch of probably absolutely just fine blue Ajaxes and put in these orange drops. Other than that, and the fact that I've recapped it, this is a pretty good example of how Fender did it from the factory. So this is the one we're going to be using. Now I'm saying Fender amps, but I mean specifically 61 through 80, or early 62 through 80. 60 and 61 were transition years. The 50s amps are much more like the Marshall example to an extent, though some of this stuff does apply. We'll get to that. The number one rule that you want to keep in mind with any amplifier in general is that as you add filtering, so 1 filter stage, 2 filter stages, 3 filter stages, 4 filter stages, 5 filter stages, the ground gets cleaner. There's less noise. So this ground is a clean ground, because this has 4 filter stages on it. The ground here only has 1 filter stage on it. It has the most noise on that ground. So you want to have it kind of go from the noisiest to the quietest, from the power supply to the input jacks. Now, Fender has, 2 different channels. It's a little bit fudged in this, but if this were a 1-channel amp and the input jacks were here and the power supply was down here, you'd want to have all the grounds separated so that the noisy stuff is down here and the quiet stuff is down here. And in just a moment, I'll show you how Fender accomplished that here. But first, let's talk about what the various stages look like in a Fender and how to recognize them. Here you can see the filter caps in this amp, and you've got 2 capacitors there at the far end. Those are actually in series. So you can see the positive is here, and the negative is here, and the positive of the next cap is here, and the negative of the next cap is here. Those 2 caps in series make up the reservoir capacitance. So we're going to label that reservoir. That's the first stage of filtering. Now this Super Reverb has 2 caps in series, like I said, and you'll see that same thing in a Twin. You'll see that same thing in a Showman. You'll see that same thing in a Bassman. You'll see that same thing in a Pro, etc. The Vibrolux and the Deluxe don't have series capacitors there. They have parallel capacitors there. So there are still 2 caps there. They're still in the reservoir stage, but traditionally they are 2 16 microfarads in parallel, making 32 microfarad. After that, the B plus goes through a choke and then comes to the screen node. And the screen node is what feeds the screens, of the power tubes. Then it goes to a dropping resistor and goes to the phase inverter node. And the phase inverter node supplies B plus to the plates of the phase inverter. Now, there is a trick to this in that both the screen and the phase inverter are all contained within the negative feedback loop of these amps. So in theory, those 2 grounds should be joined together and everything should go to chassis together. We'll see how Fender actually did that in just a moment. After the phase inverter node, it goes to another dropping resistor, and then we have the preamp node. Now in a Fender, several different gain stages, several different triodes share the same filter node. In other amps, there'll be an additional dropping resistor and an additional preamp filter node. It's not necessary in a low-gain amp like a Fender, but you'll find that in many higher-gain amps, starting with some Marshalls. But now we have the reservoir, we have the screen, we have the phase inverter, and we have the preamp. So we know what all these stages are. Let's see how they correlate inside the amplifier itself. Here and here, you see the 2 noisiest grounds in the entire circuit. This red with yellow stripe is the center tap for the HT secondary of the power transformer. And this black wire here, also going to chassis in this area, is connected to the reservoir cap negative. So this is the other noisy ground. These should not be shared with anything else. It's fine if they were connected together. If this wire were longer, it could be connected here. In some Fenders, you see that. In some later Fenders, starting in 66, instead of going to chassis like this, you would see a little ground lug underneath the mounting hardware for the transformer bolts. And while that would be held in place by this nut, it would often also be soldered to chassis. The trouble is, over time, over decades, the weight of the transformer kind of warps the steel, and those nuts work loose, and those solder joints break, and then dirt builds up underneath the non-tight connection, and you have bad grounds. When you solder to chassis like they did before 66, you have a much more reliable connection. And you can see where I've cleaned the chassis before remaking these grounds. But the larger point here is that this is noisy, they need to be grounded separately from everything else. Now here we have the bias supply. On some Fenders, like a Twin, you also have a solid-state rectification here. On this Super Reverb, it's just the bias supply, and then the heater balance resistors. The heater balance resistors and the bias supply should be separated from the noisy stuff, like I talked about. They don't need to be down here at this end of the chassis. In fact, there are those who think that the heater supply ground reference should be tied to the input. In a Fender, this always works. This works in part because there's very little gain in a Fender, so there's not a lot of gain amplifying residual background noise. It also works because the bias supply inherently has low current, and in normal operation of the heaters, there's very little current through these resistors. It's just a reference. Now, the ground reference for the bias board is made mostly to this ground here on the chassis, and that's right here where the positive of the cap goes, because the positive is at ground because it's a negative voltage in the bias supply. And on most Fenders which have heater balance resistors, these resistors are actually going to here. When I redo them, I move them to here so that if they need to be replaced in the future, it's much easier. You don't have to get out the big iron to heat up the chassis. A regular soldering iron will do right here, and these are electronically equivalent. But the bias also goes here to this pot, and then is going through this resistor from the pot to ground, and the ground is right here on the shell of the pot. This, electronically, is the same ground as this. In theory, it would be better for this resistor to be grounded here, or for this to all be grounded here. Again, because of low current, it really doesn't matter where the ground is. You can ignore this additional capacitor. It's not in most Fenders. It's not in stock Fenders at all, but it is a trick to lower noise on the bias supply. What is crucial, and I do this on every amp that comes in, is I remove this bias pot, and I clean that area of the chassis, and I clean the pot, and I clean the toothed washer, and I reinstall everything, and I make sure I have really good metal-to-metal contact, and that's very tight, because you do not want this ground reference to be faulty, because then your bias goes crazy. This next one's a little bit tricky to conceptualize because very few amp manufacturers actually adhere to what is theoretically best. And again, it comes down to sometimes you can cut some corners because of low current situations. So we're talking now about what the screen node does. Now the screen is giving the B+ to here and here, and it has its own negative. Like I said, it is within the negative feedback loop, so that negative should go to the phase inverter, which is grounded here in a Fender, going to this point right here. And so in theory, all the grounds of this screen supply would also go here, including the filter cap. Now the filter cap is not going to ground here for that stage in a Fender. I'll show you where it is going later. But the grounds which conceptually are a part of the screen supply are the cathode grounds for the tubes, the output tubes, and the ground reference for the negative of the speaker jack. Now the speaker jack, the speaker negative only needs to be grounded in an amp which has negative feedback. That's what makes it negative. If you don't have negative feedback in an amp, then you don't actually have to have the output jack ground tied to chassis in any way, though it is good practice regardless. But in theory, I should have a wire from the output jacks, which should be isolated from the chassis, going to this ground, and each one of these output tube cathodes should also have wires going to this here. And in some amps, that is achieved and done, and that can be a good thing. But in a lower gain amp, and I'm not just a Fender, but most Marshalls, it's fine for the output tube cathodes to be grounded to chassis right here or here. In a Marshall, it'll also be done with the mounting hardware on the tube socket. And for the output jack connection to the speakers to be grounded to one of those same reference points. So while theoretically this ground is this ground and this ground is this, these grounds are this ground, in practice it's rarely done. That's fine. The important thing to note, though, is that this ground for this, and these grounds for these, and this ground for this is still very separate from those noisy grounds in the reservoir and HT center tap nodes I talked about. So that's what Fender is doing well. The phase inverter ground, again, is part of the negative feedback loop, and it is going to chassis here from this cathode here, which, well, this resistor here is part of the negative feedback voltage divider. Then we have the tail resistor and the cathode resistor in the phase inverter. So that is all going to ground here, as is the ground here from the tremolo circuit, and the B plus node here is actually derived from the screen. So the screen is powering the tremolo, and it is also going to ground here at the tremolo. Another place in a Fender where the concept deviates from the reality. Conceptually, each one of these cathodes, which currently has its own dedicated connection to chassis, should be tied together and then going to chassis only from one area, because each one of these cathodes is in a triode whose B plus is tied to the same preamp node. So this yellow wire shows us our preamp node connections here to here to here. So all the plates that are connected with all these cathodes are all on the same node, so all these cathodes should go together. So here to here to here, and then to chassis or some other variation on that. The reason the Fender doesn't do it that way is twofold. First of all, it's easier to build this way. Secondly, these eyelets are only so big, there's only so many wire leads you can fit in them. So again, they're getting away with this because it's a very low gain amp in the grand scheme of things. If you do this with a Marshall, you will have a benefit to tying them together and having them to go to chassis at the point where the filter cap for that stage is connected. But now it's time to talk about the filter cap grounding in a Fender. Right here, partially hidden by this bundle of wires, is a black wire coming from the doghouse to this brass control panel. And that is the ground for the preamp, phase inverter, and screen filter caps all tied together. Now, this is what you get up to about 1971, 72. Starting in 72, they did separate those, and you end up getting a lot of spaghetti in the doghouse because there are two extra wires, and they're thick wires, and they're going to other places in the amp than here. And while you would expect that they would be going to the places I designated, where that would be the screen and the phase inverter, and that would be the preamp, well, the screen is actually going down here, and the phase inverter is actually going over here. It's really not ideal. In general, it's best to rewire them like they did before 1971, 72. You end up with fewer wires, you end up with a much shorter path to ground, because that is a factor. You want a short distance to any chassis grounds whenever possible. Another little thing to point out on Fender grounds, in this 65 example, you can see the lug one of these pots is going directly to the shell of each pot, and where there's a resistor, it's also going to the shell of the pot. Later in the 60s, they started having metal braided wires coming up, so the pot would actually run directly to the brass control panel through one of those braided metal wires, and that would continue all the way down, and resistors would also be soldered to this. That's much harder to implement. Maybe it made assembly faster in the factory. There's no advantage or disadvantage to either way. This is easier for most people to achieve, but they're both interchangeable. However, later in the 70s, instead of having a direct-to-chassis connection for these grounds, they would start to use wires, say from here to here, and then run all the way to the board, sometimes to the cathode. And then you'd end up with long loops, and that spaghetti wire wasn't great, and it can actually begin to corrode inside the insulation. So when I redo it, even if it's an example which had the spaghetti, I tend to redo it like this. Now, like I mentioned in the previous Fender Twin video, if you have an alpha pot, it's really difficult to solder to the shell of the alpha pot. So you really do want to use a wire from that lug going to chassis, whether it's going to the brass control panel or just to one of these connections on these input jacks if necessary. If you need to do a repair that's reliable and you don't have access to a big iron that can heat up this brass control strip, and you need to change out a pot on the road, and the only thing you can get is a 1 meg alpha audio taper, put that in there and run a wire right from there to this ground lug on this jack and you'll be fine. You can always change it, make it look factory later. The important thing is to have a good, reliable ground, and that would work. Speaking of this brass control strip, people often ask when they're building a kit, do they need to buy one? Do they need to make one? What benefit does it offer? Electronically, it is a transparent thing when everything is clean. You don't need to have it as long as you have good grounds in the same locations. That means you can either have a steel chassis without this and you solder to the steel chassis, which is trickier to solder to than to the brass, or you could have ground lugs coming through screws through an aluminum chassis and replicate the ground layout just using actual ground lugs screwed into the aluminum chassis. Or if you want, you can buy this brass control panel. I think that Fender used the brass control panel because it meant that they could pretty much pre-wire all this stuff, have all the pots on the brass control panel, have all the grounds made, have it ready to go, then slide the entire thing into a chassis and do the final assembly. I think it was just a means of speeding up production and being consistent, and it is easier to make these solder joints to brass than it is to steel. But electronically, it doesn't exist if everything's clean. If you have an old amp that's got tons of corrosion and dirt between the chassis, which is actual ground, and this brass control panel, then it's no longer electronically transparent. Another ground oddity in some Fenders, primarily in the 70s, is they would often have a wire spiraled around the bundle of wires. It would be tied to chassis ground here, and it would often be tied to a cathode ground here or here, or wherever. And it would just be there wrapped around the bundle of wires, grounded at both points. The idea was that was going to be shielding this run of wires. It doesn't really achieve that, and it's not really necessary, but what it does do is it creates a ground loop in the amp because you have a ground connection here to this wire to here, and you would also have a ground from here eventually to over here spiraling around this, so you'd have two grounds from this point to this point of different lengths. So whenever I encounter that, I always remove the ground at one end, usually this end, and I'll leave the ground connected at the chassis side so that it still provides shielding, but it's no longer a path that current can follow. It's just going to provide a shield. So you don't have to remove them, but you want to make sure that they are telescoped and only connected to ground at one end. And a last look at these filter caps. Again, the ground for the reservoir is here. And underneath the board, we have wires from here to here, and here to here, here to here, here to here, and here to here. On later amps, they're mounted on top of the board. They're very easy to see. These earlier examples, they're mounted beneath the board. When I redo one like the 72 I have in the other room, and I need to redo it, I redo it like this. I think it's nicer, it's neater. This was their better era, and it's nice to have aspects of that make sense. And again, beneath the board, this screen node is going to here to this phase inverter node, and then you have a little loop underneath the board going here to the preamp, and this is the wire that goes to chassis. And in the 70s, again, these were separated, so you'd have a wire for here, and a wire for here, and a wire for here. But it gets really convoluted and crowded in there when you do that, especially given the big, thick spaghetti they used. So if you see an amp where the wire is on top, that can be factory. And if you see an amp where it has individual grounds, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Make sure that the old wire has not corroded, because seriously, whatever wire they're using in the 70s, the last half inch of it underneath the insulation often turns green and corroded and gets unreliable. This cloth covered stuff, when it's not full of contaminants and the cotton, is much better. And there are better wires to use, of course, than either. If I were rebuilding a 70s, I would use modern top-coated wire, like you'd find in a Marshall replica. It's good stuff. Or you can use Teflon-coated, stranded. There's lots of great wire out there. But there's no need to replace the cotton stuff on site. But I rarely trust the old white plastic spaghetti from the 70s because I've just had too many bad examples of it. I think that about covers the big points. Let me know if you have questions or I missed anything. And as always, thanks for watching.